The plea bargain. In open court, Wilkerson said to Capone, you cannot bargain with the federal court.
The letter to the IRS hadn't worked. The plea bargain hadn't worked. Capone was in trouble.
And I suspect at that point Capone was fairly shaken that things had changed. And now he was looking at however many years of jail if he got convicted, as opposed to if you get sentenced to 3 years with good behavior, you do a third, you're out in a year, etc. He could be back in Chicago in no time.
A few days later, Frank Wilson got a call from Mike Malone. He'd heard the Capone guys talking. Capone had ordered a hit on Wilson. Wilson's reaction was surprising. He swore out a warrant for Capone's arrest, got a detail of detectives, and went out looking for the men Capone had sent to kill him. When Capone heard about the warrant, he called the hit off. He was already in enough trouble. On June 5th, 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 2 separate charges: income tax evasion and prohibition violation. 3 months later, he opened a soup kitchen for the people of Chicago, unemployed because of the Great Depression.
Coincidentally, that was right before his income tax evasion trial, and it was closed not long after the income tax evasion trial ended. So that looks like it was nothing more than a publicity ploy to get a little bit of good publicity splashed all over the newspapers for Capone with the public around the time that the case is going to go to trial and that it's being heard at trial.
Capone spent the summer before the trial at his hideout in Lansing, Michigan. Before he left, he gave his gang a job to do. He had one more rabbit up his sleeve. If it worked, there was no way he'd ever be found guilty. Intelligence agent Frank Wilson arrived at the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago early in the morning of October 6, 1931. No one stopped him. No one knew who he was. Elliot Ness would be in the courtroom too, but only as an observer. Both teams of government agents had done their jobs. Ness and his untouchables had submitted 5,000 indictments against Capone for prohibition violation. Frank Wilson and the Internal Revenue Intelligence agents had subpoenaed 75 witnesses for their case. By the time they were done, they had evidence that Capone made at least $1 million in his 7 years as Chicago's mob boss. After weighing both cases, the judge had decided the income tax case was stronger. The day would belong to Wilson, his Internal Revenue agents, and the Secret Six. If he was found guilty of income tax evasion, Capone faced up to 34 years in prison and a fine of $90,000. Ironically, out on the streets, Capone's gang was fighting what would be the last of the gang wars over bootlegging in Chicago. When this one was over, Capone would be the only warlord still standing. The newspapers would report that Capone looked confident when he entered the courtroom. Frank Wilson, sitting at the defense table, knew why.
They had somehow obtained the names of the jurors, which is the first step to then going and trying to bribe jurors, intimidate jurors, etc., etc., etc.
Agent Mike Malone, still working undercover, had gotten word to Wilson, and Wilson had notified the judge.
When Judge Wilkerson found out about it, what he did was switch jury panels, switched the list from his courtroom with another judge, and they came in with a completely new group of potential jurors, which then would have been a surprise to Capone and his men who were working on trying to suborn the jury.
The Capone trial got underway with a new jury, one the newspapers had their fun with. It seemed poetic justice that slick Al Capone was to face a jury of rural gentlemen of careless dress. There were 3 key pieces of evidence: the letter from Capone's lawyer estimating Capone's income at $50,000 a year for 4 years, and the testimony of the star witnesses. Capone cashiers Reese and Shumway. Capone's attorneys seemed to be caught off guard by the income tax charges.
They got some bookies to testify to how much Capone lost gambling, but it was virtually irrelevant.
Through it all, Capone maintained his composure, looking almost disinterested at times.
It's not clear that Capone showed any really visible reactions in the court itself during the trial. I mean, again, this is what happens when you're a gangster. This is part of what goes on. They come after you. In that business especially, you try and keep your nerve up and not show that they're getting to you.
The outcome of the trial is recorded in history. Al Capone was found guilty of income tax evasion for the years 1925, 26, and 27, and for failing to file returns in 1928 and 29. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison and fined $80,000. It was the most severe sentence ever given in an income tax evasion case. Income tax evasion might have seemed a flimsy ending for one of the most brutal gangsters of all time, but it got the job done. Or did it? University of Nebraska professor Dennis Hoffman has uncovered information that he believes puts yet another twist to the Al Capone case. Professor Hoffman believes even though the income tax evasion case was strong enough to convict Capone, the government had a second safeguard in place, just in case. The case against Capone might not have been about prohibition, but according to Professor Hoffman, the local government had stacked the jury with a group of men who were violently opposed to alcohol. They were part of a system put in place in Chicago to make sure bootleggers like Capone went to jail, no matter what the charge. The Al Capone jury may have looked like rural folk to newspaper reporters, but it was something much more dangerous to a bootlegger like Capone, a group of moralist prohibitionists.
If you're a big-time gangster and you're going on trial, don't expect that you're going to be afforded all the rights guaranteed to you under the Constitution.
Who knew about the prohibitionist jury system in place for the Capone trial, and who didn't? Did the judge who dismissed Ness's prohibition charges in favor of the income tax case know? The prosecutor? How high up did it go? That's a question still to be answered. On October 24th, 1931, Al Capone's reign over Chicago came to an end. The man who had held the city in his grip for almost a decade was finally going to prison. The Chicago newspapers applauded the end of the Capone era. When interviewed about the trial, Capone gave one last salute. Not to the U.S. Treasury agents history would name as his archenemy, Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, but to the businessmen of Chicago he respected, the Secret Six.
Well, I think the major contribution of Eliot Ness and the Untouchables was to hit Capone's stream of income to the extent possible. They didn't dry up Chicago. They didn't totally eliminate Capone's ability to produce alcohol or to make money, but they put a crimp in his activities. They were a hindrance. On the grand scale of things, though, that was very, very secondary compared to the what resulted in the income tax evasion conviction.
The Secret Six, maintaining its desire to keep its members' identities secret, had stayed away from the courtroom, but they'd kept close tabs on what was happening. In a newspaper interview after the trial, Robert Isham Randolph, the leader of the group, said he felt the Six's contribution was letting the underworld know it had a new non-political foe to contend with. The case was over. The bad guy had been put away. But had the government given Capone a fair trial? Or had it done what it thought it had to do and concluded that the end justified the means.
This trial was really about restoring the legitimacy of the federal government. At the time, the federal government was failing to seriously address the problem of depression. The Hoover administration was failing to deal with problems of unemployed people. It was also failing in its attempts to enforce prohibition. And so the trial of Al Capone presented Hoover with an opportunity to restore the credibility of the federal government.
The government, even today, zeroes in on certain people. I don't have much feeling that the intelligence unit, or because of the President of the United States, zeroed in on a bum like Al Capone. I mean, he was a murderer.
After the conviction in 1931, Al Capone was sent to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, then to Alcatraz, to serve out his 11-year sentence. One day in 1939, he started to get confused. He couldn't speak. He was diagnosed with neurosyphilis. He'd contracted it when he was a young man.
In 1939, even the federal government recognizes that he's not a threat to anyone anymore. They actually give him early release, recognizing that he's not going to go back to Chicago and take over at the helm of what was now the Chicago outfit led by Frank Nitti. Nitti got what Capone had built and consolidated that after Prohibition. So Capone was not a danger to anyone in the public by and large.
His wife and only child, Sonny, took him to his Florida mansion, where he died of a heart attack on January 25th, 1947. He was 48. After the Capone conviction, many U.S. citizens contacted the Internal Revenue, eager to pay their delinquent taxes. The amount collected was in excess of $1 million. In 1968, the Federal Jury System Selection and Service Act mandated that jurors be chosen from lists of registered voters to abolish the prohibitionist jury system. People in organized crime went to school on the Capone trial.
The lesson to them was keep a low profile, go underground. If you're going to engage in criminality and skullduggery, do not broadcast it to the world.
For the Secret Six, what started out as a black and white issue began to turn gray.
The Secret Six got caught tapping the telephones of State's Attorney Swanson. When those claims were subjected to the scrutiny of a grand jury, nothing happened.
Their vigilante days were over. Wilson's mob informant, Eddie O'Hare, became a respectable businessman. But 8 days before Capone was released from prison, O'Hare was gunned down. Frank Wilson fulfilled his promise to him. He made sure O'Hare's son, Butch O'Hare, got into Annapolis.
Well, his son graduated from Annapolis, became a naval aviator, and in fact was an ace during World War II. Shot down 5 Japanese planes on one mission, eventually lost his life in the Pacific. Eventually they named the new airport in Chicago, O'Hare Field, after Butch O'Hare, who was Eddie O'Hare's son.
Frank Wilson of the IRS Intelligence Unit went on to head the U.S. Secret Service and was charged with the security of U.S. knowledge of the atom bomb. When the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, Charles Lindbergh asked for his help. And the intelligence unit went on to investigate other racketeers in New York, winning 250 convictions. As the years passed, the names of the people who brought Al Capone down faded from history. The story of a vicious yet charismatic gangster and the handsome treasury agent who was his archenemy evolved instead.
I think we just smile at it. We never took that personal that Elliot Ness gets the credit. We really never did.
The idea that a group of wealthy businessmen and a handful of Internal Revenue agents could be, under their three-piece suits, superheroes, well,